But really what I wanted us to be able to do today was to have a conversation about how the intersection of race and poverty impacts us in Milwaukee. And there's lots of good resources out there. I think if people have looked, they've seen in terms of looking at the younger generation, the Children's Defense Fund does a really excellent resource gathering countrywide, but then also does state by state and looks at a number of things. So, Social Development Commission does their own take into poverty. And what's great in Wisconsin is the institute that's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is the Urban Institute on Poverty Research. And they've done some excellent research also. So there's a lot of good resources that are local or close to local in terms of various locations. But since I work at the YWCA, a couple of years ago, our management team decided to read this book together and talk about it, One Nation Underprivileged, by Mark Robert Rank, which if people haven't heard of it or know of it, it's a really good book that does an excellent analysis of poverty and really tries to debunk many of the myths that we all have lived with or lived under. And the chapter that I was really trying to focus some of my attention on was the chapter where he really pulls apart that it's not individual failings that have caused poverty or caused people to be in poverty. And it's sort of when I talk about, and looking at Idisol, who was just recently in our class, when we talk about racism, there's layers to looking at racism. And where many people enter the conversation or start thinking about race and racism is around the individual aspect of racism, which is the horrific, it's horrific in terms of how people can get targeted by racism and what happens as a result of that. I think the same is true in terms of poverty. And too often what has happened is the analysis has stopped there. And it's an individual's failings that they're in poverty and, why can't they, same mentality as looking at race and racism is why can't they pull themselves up by their bootstraps when in many cases they don't have bootstraps to pull up. So the challenge in looking at the intersection of these is really where it structurally hits. And so the structural aspect is all the collapsing aspects of, that there just aren't jobs or family sustaining wage type jobs available, which I'm sure Jim spent a lot of time on in terms of looking at unemployment. But then when you add the layer of the safety net, that's out there, but not necessarily as broad a safety net with many of those programs being cut back. And recently, with our federal government facing its own debt crisis, it has made some of those programs be the first on the chopping block in terms of, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, earned income tax credit. Some of those structural things are really strong. And then I think it was last week, was it, that David Reamer did his plan aims to cut Wisconsin's poverty rate in half. I think that was just last week.
Couple weeks.
Was it that long ago?
Yeah.
Okay, anyway. But part of what he's talking about, and David Reamer is at the Community Advocates Public Policy arm, and talked about how we would have a far greater problem in terms of poverty if some of these programs and structures were not in place. So he talks about it in terms of the University of Wisconsin's Institute for Research on Poverty shows that the poverty rate would be about double what it is now without those government programs, such as Social Security, SSI, food stamps, or an income tax credit. So he said the story is that poverty would be enormous, but for certain programs, those programs have dramatically reduced poverty. But if you look generationally, if you go back and look at the data from 1959 to 2009, I think it was, that the Children's Defense Fund did, it's staggering in terms of how we really were doing well in the 70s, I think it was. And, so how much we've kind of fallen off being able to provide that safety net. So, but anyway, Mark Robert, whatever the guy's name is, has done a really good job of looking at all those structural things and really debunking that it's any individual failings, that it's really much more about the larger So what I did was I tried to pull a sheet together that has kind of and used a template that was out there on Word. So it had a pretty border on it. Made it kind of a pain in terms of getting everything to fit. But it's here. So I was trying to pull some research pieces that came from various Journal Sentinel online articles that were specific to Milwaukee. But then Tatiana had sent us the stuff in terms of the Pew Hispanic Research Center. And so I tried to pull some data points from that, and that was interesting. So if you look, once they all make their way around, if you look at the top chart comparing official and supplemental poverty rates, that was confusing to me because I had not heard or studied what the supplemental poverty measures mean. So it's written underneath that. So it uses a wider range of factors than the official federal measure. So when that's taken into effect, a greater share of Hispanics in 2010 lived in poverty than any other group. By contrast, when using the official poverty rate, a greater share of blacks in 2010 lived in poverty. Even so, no matter which measure is used, Hispanics make up nearly 3 in 10. So the challenge is when you start to do the numbers, when you share statistics with people, it just gets overwhelming, your mind sort of shuts down. It's numbing, I guess, is a way to look at it. And so it would be, in terms of looking at us, in terms of what they were talking about, more than 4 out of 10 school-age children in Milwaukee are living in poverty, a jump of nearly 10 percentage points. 82% of the district's children qualify for a 3-year reduced price lunch. So essentially, pretty much everybody in here, but maybe one person would not qualify if we wanted to put it into numbers that make more sense. I heard the superintendent speak, and many of you may have been at the SDC's Poverty Symposium, where he just talked about how many of the young people now receive free breakfast, free lunch, and stay after school and have free dinner, which is how many of them are surviving in terms of getting by. So poverty in terms of young children has really made it a challenge. But then if you look at the older generation, the new disparity in nursing homes, I just threw that in there because I think as we look at older, new study by those at Brown University found that more Latino, Black, and Asian seniors are moving into nursing homes while white seniors are choosing other options, driven by changing demographics. But it's also clear that many elders of color can't afford another alternative but to be in a nursing home. So it sort of, once again, shows the disparities in terms of what happens across both generations and across races. So. In this book, and I can pass it around just so people can look at it, Chapter 3 is the one that, that quote that's on the bottom, U.S. poverty is largely the result of structure of families at the economic, political, and social levels, lack of adequately paying jobs, ineffective social safety net, and a life course risk of impoverishment. That, I think in his book he talks about that at some point in time, 3/4 of the population will be poor. And it's not due to, oftentimes it can be a medical emergency that happens in a family that can just crush a family under debt. It could be any number of things. One of the stories that's in here, James Causey did this story about Crystal Johnson, and she, was getting by as a single parent and was getting her kids off to school and was doing everything, was working for her until her vehicle broke down, and a $1,700 engine repair bill was not something that she could afford. So she ended up in, shelters and in a homeless situation. So talked about how quickly her life sort of crumbled away from her. And I think that's the challenge is those personal stories are what are heartbreaking and hard for us to look at, but what's underneath it is probably the bigger issue, the structural issues of where we have failed, as a nation to look at some of those aspects that have more to do with jobs and things. So I just thought what would be useful today would be for us to have a conversation about those intersections and what you've seen in the work that you're doing and the agencies that you work with. It's always hard to find the positives in terms of what programs are working, depending upon what you read. David Reamer has his own approach, and he's determined 4 different things that he wants to see happen. And he's looking at the whole state, so he's not just looking at Wisconsin or just Milwaukee. But his, what he would like to see for policy changes are a new tax credit for poor seniors and disabled people aimed to lift them above the poverty line, a transitional jobs program, which we have one component of that going on at the YWCA, offering the unemployed temporary jobs for up to 30 weeks and raising the state's minimum wage to $8 an hour, and then reforming that federal earned-based tax credits to make them more generous to low-income families and individuals. So he's got 4 things that are out there that he's saying, and many, you know, if you read lots of different resources, the Institute, the University of Wisconsin's Institute would say, too often we try things, but we don't try them long enough, or we don't, you know, put a program out there and then really analyze it to see was it effective, how effective was it, et cetera. So many of the programs that you work in, you know, in terms of which is first, the chicken or the egg, you know, is it just the family's wage? No, it's more than that in terms of all the factors that come together. So I just thought we could open it up for a conversation to see where people were at, what they were thinking about, what they've seen, witnessed. I do not need to be the only expert in the room.